Welcome to today's webcast of Get the Best of All the Brains in a Crisis and Beyond. My name is Demet Tunç. I lead the Customer Experience Council at the Conference Board. I also consult in executive search and in leadership advisory. Today, my guest speaker, Kate Lance, will share insights with us from her doctoral research into how our brain works and how the brain gender plays an important role and how our brain's stress responses are important in delivering a good business performance. She will also talk about what you can do to manage your mind for an optimal performance and support others, your colleagues, your team members to do the same. Before we go into the content of this interesting discussion, let me first give you a couple of tips about joining this webcast. Throughout the webcast, you can ask questions through the chat box which appears at the left bottom of your screen. This is a very engaging conversation, so we do expect you to participate with your questions, with your comments. You can also download the presentation if you would like to. We would be very happy if you share this webcast with people who might be interested in this topic. Also, by joining this webcast, you can earn credits. To be able to do so, you need to click on the link and the three pop-ups that will appear throughout the webcast so that you can earn the credits. I think that is all about the practical points about this webcast. Now let me introduce you to Kate. First of all, welcome, Kate.
Thank you.
Kate is the CEO of MindBridge, which is a company that specializes in consulting and also coaching senior executives. She has over 30 years of professional background in leadership coaching combined with a corporate background. She was the first female, and I think the youngest one, as international general manager at Diageo, which is one of the world's leading spirits producer. During the crisis in 2008, during and after the crisis in 2008, she found herself fascinated by the patterns of behavior of her clients, of her teammates, of her colleagues at work, and she wanted to understand what it means for a business performance on how the brain works. Currently, she focuses on the power of modern neuroscience for releasing the latent brain potential at work. She's the co-author of All the Brains in the Business book, which I enjoyed reading a lot. This is not a thick book, but it took me quite some time to read it because as you read the book, you reflect, you think about your own experiences, and you go back and you read that sentence, that paragraph again. So she has written this book with Paul Brown, and now it's available on Amazon. Kate, while I was reading your book, it took me back to some memories of my corporate life, and I wish I had read your book 10 years, 20 years earlier, because I understand that understanding how the brain gender works and how we can utilize the best of our brains is very important. And in your book, you provide very practical analysis and solutions, and everything is based on science. So I wish I had known it earlier to be a better or a more effective leader. You say that the average loss of brain potential is 30% on a working day, which is a very big, significant loss of brain power. So you also say that there are these structural differences between male and female brains. Apparently, the brain gender is not necessarily determined by our biological sex. So why is it important to understand this, and how can we get the best brain power for an effective organization?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Demet, for the kind introduction, and absolutely, that's why I wrote the book because as I was researching what was going on with my clients and how they were not always able to bring the best of their brains to their work, and I started to investigate what does it take to get the absolute optimal conditions for brains to do their best thinking. It became very obvious very quickly that you cannot ignore brain gender because there are at a biological level, there are neurobiological differences between female and male brains. And those differences occur on three dimensions. So the differences in brain structure, differences in neural connectivity, and differences in hormone levels, which impact the chemicals in the brain. And those differences don't happen. It's not binary. It's not like men's brains are like this and women's brains are like that. It's far more complex and subtle and sophisticated. And so our biological underpinning, the biological brain expresses itself through the experiences that we have growing up. And there's the blend of nature and nurture, and that will determine the brain sex that you have. And that exists like it's like a mosaic. So male brains will have more blue tiles in the mix, and I'm using stereotypical colors here, so forgive me for that. And the female brains will have more sort of pink tiles in the mix. But really understanding your individual brain is where the potency comes, because then you can absolutely find out how to bring the best of your brain to the party.
So what are the major differences between a female and a male brain?
Yeah, so as I say, structure, neural connectivity, and hormones. And there's a diagram that I want to show to you because it just says it beautifully. So this now we're looking at the neural connectivity. There are about 100 differences between female male brains. As in business, my research is demonstrating about 30 of those are important for leaders to understand and know about for themselves and their teams if they're really serious about getting the best of all the brains. And so here, and this is some fascinating research from the University of Pennsylvania that came out in 2014, what you can see in the blue image is the neural connectivity running front to back inside each hemisphere. And in the red image, you can see the neural connectivity running very much between hemispheres. So the blue image, this is a male brain, and the red image is the female brain. So what does that mean in practice? What that means is that those two brain patterns will pay attention and notice things in different ways. So it's more likely that the male brain will focus in a more narrow way to solve a problem. And the female brain, the way that brain pays attention is more iterative and emergent. So you get different types of attention being paid. Now, Paul, with whom I co-wrote the book, because we wanted to practice what we preach in terms of partnering with the difference, the way Paul would frame this, and I think he does in the book, is that men fix problems, women generate solutions. And those are just, that's that again, the risk is it sounds a bit stereotypical. The point being, there is a complementarity there that has evolved into our brains. And if we understand these things, we can leverage them. And this is the work that Paul and I are doing with our clients, is helping businesses really see the brain sex difference and learn how to harness it.
Actually, Paul in the book says that men do what they do in order to find out who they are. Women do what they do because of who they are. So actually, I really love this, and this actually shows that there are
Yeah.
differences, and actually we complement each other. Men and women complement each other. There is not like right or wrong way,
Yeah.
but there's a different way the brain works. And that is why it's important to understand how the brain works. And also, you mentioned to this in your book, over the 2 million years of evolution, the female brains are there to collaborate and to seek for connection. and the male brains are there to compete. The males go there to hunt, bring the animal to the tribe, and the female brains are there to get together, to eat the animal together, to collaborate, to share, and to it's a different way of working, and this is dependent on the full evolution of the human history, right?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, in bioevolutionary terms, we can't prove what's happened in our human history, but we can look at the differences that have evolved, and they've evolved for good reason. That's what evolution does. The differences are not binary by any stretch of the imagination. They exist on a complex spectrum. That said, there are fundamental neurobiological differences. And if you know what those are, you can leverage them. And I'll just take you into this. So in the research, and you mentioned this at the beginning, Demet, what I've been looking at are how much latent brain power have organizations got just kind of sitting in the business already that's not being fully leveraged. And what my research has been showing is that there's up to 30% in certain sort of key populations. So some of the research I've been doing has been looking at top talent populations, so the people that companies want to keep and promote. And yet they're not getting the best of those brains. And what I found is that it's the brains at the more male end of the brain sex spectrum that tend to be and thrive more of the day than the brains at the more female end, be those brains in women or men with a more female brain. And so the point is there's a kind of subset of brains that are being supported by work practices, work cultures, performance measurements, etc. And other brains, it's a bit like driving with the handbrake on. So other brains where things are still moving forward. It's not that people are having a horrible time and doing nothing at work, by no means. But the kind of brain gender blindness that exists means that the brain is being driven with its handbrake on. And what Paul and I are trying to do is say that if you understand the brain gender differences and right down to an individual level, then you can really create working practices that enable all of the brains not to just be at the party, but to be genuinely invited to dance. And that will generate the neurochemistry that goes with feeling included. And that neurochemistry promotes really, really high performance.
But the way we are designed to work at work is very much male brain driven, isn't it? I mean, the way the performance management systems are done, even like when you recruit talent, the recruitment process is quite competitive. So it's not collaborative like how the female brain would work.
Yeah.
So, but is that not a trap then for the leaders to find the right talent or to grow the right talent?
Absolutely, absolutely. And to my mind, actually, what businesses that are really serious about this need to go back pretty much to the drawing board in terms of really looking at how those businesses are structured, how those businesses are populated, and the ways of working that support the work task. So there's a lot of really good initiatives that are going on within our existing work structures. But what I'm seeing is the organizations that are taking this stuff really seriously and starting to redesign how they do things, they're the ones that are winning. And really harnessing all of the latent brain power that they've got in their businesses. And so there are modifications one can make in terms of how you word a recruitment ad, how you set up the recruitment process. But I think there are more profound things that we can do that are really quite exciting. And I am seeing some clients who are starting to engage with that based on this kind of understanding.
So we are in a very busy world. We're in a very complex world. The leaders have so many things to tackle, to deal with so many issues on a daily basis. And amongst all this, now this brain topic comes into the picture. And this is we're talking about the brain. So bi means we're talking about something very complex. So in a practical way, what and how should the leaders learn and act to understand the different gender differences in the brain
Yeah.
to have
Yeah.
a good, sustainable future for their organization?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you're right, Demet. The brain is the most complex thing in the known universe. So understanding it is, it's the neuroscience is in its infancy, and what I'm trying to do is take some of the key ideas and translate those quickly and easily into concepts and models and practices that busy leaders can use, because we don't all have time to go away and do the detailed reading and research. And that's what I'm up to in the work and the research that I'm doing. So I'd just like to share with people really quickly, if I may, using the help of my friendly brain here, a little bit about how the brain has evolved. So let's just get that there. The brain evolved in three parts. So this part here is the brain stem. And that's the reptilian brain. We inherited that from our reptile ancestors. That does all the automatic functions in our bodies. The next part evolved when the first mammals came on stream, and there had to be a relationship with the live young. This is this part here, the limbic system that sits right in the center of the brain. That part of our brain responds to our environment incredibly quickly, 3 times faster than the last part of the brain to evolve, which is the prefrontal cortex. And that's about 220,000 years old. So we are emotional way before we're rational, and that is really important to know, especially when we're under stress like we are now with working through a pandemic. And I'm sure lots of people listening are working from home, working virtually, hybrid working maybe. So the limbic system responds way before the rational prefrontal cortex can respond. And it responds
And
with your...
This is valid both for male and female brains.
Absolutely valid for that. That's the way the human brain has evolved. And it's really important to know that first, that we're emotional before we're rational, because we can't begin to tap into the subtleties of brain sex difference until that's sort of well understood. And the limbic system will either put if it thinks you're under enough stress and threat, it will put you into a survive state so that you can protect yourself. If it's settled, it will allow you to move into a thrive state. And so have we got time to do a little exercise on that, Demet? I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah.
So let's do an exercise.
Okay, if I may. So survive and thrive, and put very simply, those are the dominant modes of the brain, and then I'll talk a little bit about how those differ under stress for men and women. So if we're emotional before we're rational. When we have a stress response that's triggered, that will show up in our bodies as a stress trigger way before we realize that we're stressed with our rational brain. And that will generate the neurochemistry of survive. So I'd just like people to think about, if you think about a relationship at work that puts you into survive, so it's when you see that person's name come up on your phone or your email, actually it's a kind of woo response as opposed to a woo, hurrah. So just notice when you bring that person to mind, that relationship to mind, what your physiological, your bodily response is to that survive relationship. And I don't know if you can pop just a few keywords in the chat about the response that your body might have had to a survive relationship.
Let me repeat the question. So if you're in a survive mode when you're under stress, how would you react? How would your body react? What would be your physiological reaction? If you could type in your answers to the left bottom of the screen. Muscles are tensing when you're in a survive mode. Tightness in the throat. Throat constricts.
Yeah.
Stomach hurt, stomach knot. These are very physiological impacts actually of the survive mode.
Absolutely, that's the point. The limbic brain will put...
I feel hot and then cold. Then my body stiffs. Body stiffness.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'm sure some of you listening have actually had that response just thinking about it. So it's not like you're in a meeting with that person, but just bringing the name to mind, those are the reactions. And so that's how rapidly our bodies will respond to a stress trigger. And I really wanted to highlight that in today's talk because it's particularly important now. But just before we do that, I'd just like to change our neurochemical state and get us all feeling good. So now the reverse, if you can just bring to mind a thrive relationship. So somebody, when you see their name on the phone or the email, you think, oh, lovely, I've got a call with such and such a person. Just notice what your physiological response is to a thrive relationship. And again, if you could pop that in the chat, that would be great.
Smiling. People are smiling, relaxed. People are relaxed. Sit up and forward. Lightness.
Yeah.
Shoulders dropped and relaxed.
Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. Well, I invite you all to bask in that lovely, yummy, thrive neurochemistry now that we've created it in your bodies and your brains. And just notice how quickly, so that's just me asking you that question, and we have changed your neurochemistry completely twice. And if we had been able to measure some of that neurochemistry, we would have seen in the survive state quantities of cortisol and adrenaline coming up. And in the thrive state, so stay in that yummy place, we would see oxytocin, the bonding hormone, serotonin, the kind of all is well with the world, peace neurotransmitter, and dopamine, which is the reward neurotransmitter. And so when we're in thrive, it enables, here's my handy brain again, but it enables the cortex to be on stream and doing its clever, creative, innovative thinking. So in order to perform well, the neurochemistry of thrive must be induced because we're less able to think well when we're in survive. We will still get stuff done, but it's going to be less productive. It's not optimal. And that's what I'm looking at in the research, is how able are work cultures and work practices to really enable that lovely thrive neurochemistry. And you can't do it in the ignorance of brain gender difference. You asked earlier about stress, Demet. Should I talk a little bit about the differences in stress?
Yeah, please do so. And it's also important, I mean, when we're talking about the survive and the thrive mode, how do you switch from a survive to a thrive mode?
Yeah.
And that is actually managing your stress. How do you deal with stress?
Yeah, really, really important. So let me answer that question first. So when the brain is in survive and the limbic system is dominating, it is far more powerful. It will command where the energy flow goes, the blood flow in the brain, and the attention. So when we're very stressed and triggered, we cannot think. And I'm sure we've all had those moments when we're really anxious about something where we just kind of blank out and it's really awkward. That's what's happening. It's the limbic system running the show. So because we are emotional before we're rational, because this is all happening prior to conscious thought being able to manage it, you have to calm your limbic system down first. So you must self-soothe in the first instance once you've been triggered, because otherwise you cannot think. So how do you do that? So if you can, you need to get up and move, because moving will allow the adrenaline to flow out of the body. You need to just start to let your brain see things that will soothe it. So I've got a great example from this summer, actually working with a client during lockdown, and he was getting very triggered working away from the office, which he doesn't like. He likes to be interacting with others, and things were just, not working out. So we helped him develop habits that supported him to get back into thrive. So number one, he would notice the physical trigger. So the stuff that you've been noticing for yourself, because it's all slightly different, it's personal. So what's your physiological trigger? Know what that is. Number two, stop immediately and calm yourself down. Don't just power on through and carry on with the work. Actually change your physical state like we did. So he would get up, move
Actually,
around. Sorry, go ahead, Demet.
actually, emotions drive the behavior. So when you're in a survive mode, you're quite emotional and you shouldn't do any behavior that you would regret
Absolutely.
afterwards.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely. Because your cortex is not on the pitch. The limbic system is running the show. And so this is when people ping off the emails that they wish they hadn't sent, half an hour later. It's when people pick up the phone and chew someone else out and then realize that that was a really bad idea. That's the limbic system. So my advice to my clients is as soon as you notice you've been triggered, then immediately get up and do something different to soothe your brain and your nervous system. And moving is good. Walking in nature is good. I've got a particular piece of Mozart that I listen to, which is a habit for me. My brain loves it, so it just settles my whole nervous system down. So find those little micro things that you can do quickly, because that will really start to settle the limbic brain. And then once you've done that, you can feel that shift happening like we just did with that exercise, then you can start to kind of gear back up and get the cortex back on the pitch. So it's good to feel joy. So this client, he's got a photograph on his phone of his kids and it just makes him laugh. He can't see this picture and not laugh. And so that will release dopamine in his body. And so if he's in a meeting and he can't sort of get up and walk away, he'll just have a look at this photo, and that really helps start to shift his neurochemistry. And then you can just start to engage again with your cortex and go, okay, what was there to be curious about here? Because the prefrontal cortex loves to solve problems. So get curious about what just happened, or how are you going to move the action forward? But if you can really get fast at doing those things, that will help you to kind of turn on a penny in terms of managing your state and habituating thrive, which is that's the only way you're going to do good thinking at work. So a long answer, but really important, especially now, because what's happening during the pandemic is that our limbic system and our anxiety is much closer to the surface than it would be normally, because this is dangerous. It's a pandemic and we're all working in strange ways. So it's like, really cut yourself some slack, because your brain is going to be very easily triggered, far more readily than it would have been before COVID.
Yeah, and we are in a different state of work mode at the moment. We're doing all our calls with videos, with Teams, with Zoom, Skype, whatever. And last night I was talking to somebody and I said, well, let's do a Teams call tomorrow. And his response was, I'm getting allergy to Teams. And so we are now somehow surviving, hoping that there will be an end to it. But as the news are not very positive, people again go in a mode that like they need to keep on in the state for longer than we thought, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is the hardest thing to maintain, to be positive. You give an easy tip: go up, walk, get fresh air, look at the picture of your kids. But actually, it's not as easy as it sounds.
No, absolutely. So what those tips, Demet, are, and everybody listening, those are for the micro, moment by moment by moment, when you've been triggered and and you're right in the middle of that Teams call or whatever. So those are the things that it's really useful to habituate your brain to doing, because that will help you moment by moment get through the day. The bigger picture is, absolutely, this is not easy. This is a marathon and not a sprint. And we're in virgin territory in terms of understanding the virus. So we're going to have to be kind of going with the flow to a large extent, which, brains don't like change, but they're very good at adapting. So it's really important that you support your brain to keep adapting. Now, in evolutionary terms, we have far more neuronal systems connected to watching out for what's dangerous than we do for watching out for the good stuff. So we consciously have to cultivate that thrive perspective, because our brains are wired to look out for what's going to go wrong rather than to look for what's going to go right. And so the feeding our brains positively is something we have to choose to do actively. So again, another conversation I'm having a lot with clients is manage your energy, not your time. Keep doing whatever you need to do to keep pushing your brain back into a thrive state, even if that means radically altering your agenda for the day, and getting outside, going for a walk, watching a film that makes you laugh, whatever, connecting with friends, but really make that thrive state the focus, because this is a marathon, not a sprint, and we're kind of working against, in a kind of way, the way our brains have evolved. So we have to do it consciously and deliberately and habituate it.
I would like to remind to the audience that you can ask your questions by typing in the chat box, and I will pose them to Kate when it's appropriate. In the meantime, I have a question for you, Kate. Kate, you talk about the gender difference, but not gender equality, being a source of competitive advantage. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I say, there are about 100 differences between male and female brains by nature. By nurture, those differences are even more minutely magnified, because our brains are as unique to us as our fingerprints. So understanding what those differences are and acknowledging that they're there and that they're real is a massive source of competitive advantage if you're sensitive to it and use it. So for example, one of my clients I was talking to recently, who's done some of the work with me, she and one of her male colleagues, he has a very male brain, so at the far end of the brain sex spectrum, and she has quite a female brain, and so they have some fun with knowing these sex differences in their brain. Now when they're going into pitch together to a client, they actively ask what the other one is thinking, what they would include in the pitch, what they think the pitfalls might be about the pitch, how they think that they can really develop a relationship with the client. And they leverage the fact that they know they come at things from very different perspectives, because one of the reasons is they have quite different brain sex scores. So they actively use that as a means of developing stronger relationships with the client and solving problems, bringing those different perspectives into play very actively. And that's a lovely example of exactly what we're hoping to achieve with this awareness and put out into the world through the book. Because expecting in my personal experience I was expected to be the best man I could be, and I think that still occurs for a lot of women in business, and that is missing the point. There are gender differences in the brain, and of course it's not as simple as a binary thing. I mean, some of the finest brains that in the research that I've done were male brains at the more female end of the brain sex spectrum, and they were not being consulted and asked what they thought in meetings because they didn't quite fit culturally. So it's a very complex personal thing, but with a modicum of awareness, which is what we wanted to share in the book, you can actually go an extraordinarily long way to harnessing the best of all the brains.
So you talk about brain gender difference, and diversity and inclusion is in the topic of many companies. And actually, first they want to hire female talent, but inclusion is as important as, I think, diversity. And when we say diversity, it's not only the gender diversity, but it's the diversity of many things, right? So could you please elaborate a bit on that and how brain functions to get the best performance out?
Yes, absolutely. What I'll do, I'll just talk, because I realize we didn't pick up on the differences in the stress reaction, Demet, so I'll talk about that. Yes. And then I'll share one of the models that I've been testing in the research. just because I think it's, having come from business myself, what matters is, so how do I do this? So very quickly, the stress response, under stress, the male brain, men have more testosterone in their brains and bodies than women, by quite some margin. Under stress, the testosterone levels are likely to go up for a man. So the stress response, in order to soothe, very often men will compete with each other. And I'm sure some of you have, seen this in your own work environments, because that is actually soothing to the nervous system. In the female brain and body, the oxytocin levels will go up under stress, and this female stress response can very often be to seek to connect and collaborate. So we hear a lot about fight, flight, and freeze. There is actually a fourth defense response, survival response, which is tend and befriend, and that is more typically female and gets often overlooked. And so you've got neurochemically, you've got both brain genders going in different directions under stress. Now that, and I've seen this happen a lot in client situations, can be massively misunderstood, which is just not helpful. Whereas if you understand that's what's happening, you can help each other to remedy and come back into a more productive state and not start misunderstanding each other. So I just wanted to share that, because I think it's really important. And Demet, you asked about some how-tos, so let's just have a look. So the first thing you must do is and this is, I developed this in order to run brain-friendly meetings, which would encompass all the brains in the meeting. It's actually a model that can be used in a whole variety of different circumstances. But what you must do first of all is connect, because the limbic brain knows when it's connected and safe. So find ways to connect with all the people in the conversation, in the meeting, and do that with generosity and compassion. We can't stop our brains from judging, because that happens pre-consciously, but what we can do is be consciously compassionate. And so if we see somebody who feels like an outsider or just not comfortable to speak up in the meeting or whatever, reach out, be compassionate. Once all the brains in the meeting feel included, the limbic system will settle down, and then you can start to get the prefrontal cortex onto the pitch, and this is where the real work happens. But you can't do it until you've done the first two. So curiosity, be really curious. What do all the brains in that meeting think? And I've had clients figuring out ways of doing this at huge scale, where they're virtually tapping into, hundreds and thousands of people in some cases, but deliberately being curious and finding ways, deploying the technology to capture that curiosity. And by control, our brains like to know that they've got the freedom to think and express themselves. When we feel that someone's about to come in and interrupt us or whatever, will trigger survive and we won't think well. So it's like, give the brains the airtime to express their thoughts. For a female brain, that might be different, given the iterative neural patterning from a male brain. But if everybody knows in that conversation that they've genuinely got control, they will be more relaxed and you'll get the best of their thinking. So in terms of a how-to, this is something that I've been trying and testing with clients. At one level, it's incredibly simple, and at another level, it's incredibly potent, because it works in the way that the brain works.
Interesting. Are there any questions from the audience? Okay. Right, very interesting. So, Kate, knowing as much as you can about your own brain and also the brains of your teams and colleagues is probably to enable the conditions that create the optimal energy flow, as you say. And that's also what you go and repeat in your book all the time. And it's also dependent a lot on many other factors, like the way you're brought up, the culture you're in. I don't know if it's that simple to differentiate as like human brain and male brain, but it's also, I'm sorry, male brain and female brain, but it's also the way the culture impacts you is shaping up the way you would respond to things, the way you would react, the way you would handle. So how do you put that culture element into this brain picture?
Yeah, no, a great question, Demet, because as I say, our brains are as unique to us as our fingerprints. And so it's important to understand your own, I call it Trustprint, and that's a very specific interview that I'll do with clients individually to help them understand their own Trustprint as leaders. But the better you can know your own Trustprint and that of your colleagues, the more that you can support each other to move into a thrive state and out of a survive state. And you know, that takes connection and conversation to build up the trust. Now, obviously, that's harder as we're all being forced into a virtual environment. So I'm doing work with some teams where they haven't even met as a team in person yet. And quite frankly, they're not going to be able to do that for several months to come. So, you know, how can you form those connections in this virtual world? And one has to be ingenious and determined about it, so that you get to know people personally to the best of your ability. And obviously, if that's with your own intact work team, that's one level. If you're trying to connect with thousands of people across a whole organization, that's a different scale of initiative. And that's where actually they're helping leaders think about their use of the technology and how they can come across as more personable in the technology is something that I'm talking to some of my CEO clients about, because it matters. We need to connect emotionally before we can actually forge, get into the fullness of what the prefrontal cortex has to offer. And for each of us, our cultures as men and women and just people will have an impact on how our own brain responds to thrive. And so the more you can understand that and talk about it, obviously in appropriate ways in a business context, the better, because the oxytocin is the neurochemical of trust, and people that perform well at work feel safe. Teams that perform well really trust each other. My youngest son would call it the kind of "they've got my back" quotient. Do you really feel like your colleagues have got your back? And developing that trust just takes more work and a deliberate reaching out to connect in these COVID days. So one of my clients, she put one of her team members onto connecting with the wider group, and this part of this lady's job. So the lady was let off some of her targets so that she could actually spend time connecting. They had some single mums in the team who had very different challenges than some of the families without children in the team, etc. But the leader was very concerned that she knew what everybody's personal situation was, and was supporting in the best way that she could, so showing that compassion. So she literally had somebody whose job it was during the height of the lockdown to connect as broadly as she possibly could, and that really paid dividends in terms of loyalty, enthusiasm, people having practical support that they might not have had otherwise. So I'm hearing of some inspiring ways that companies and individuals and leaders are dealing with this.
Well, we had a question, but I think you mentioned it as you talked. Can you define the Trustprint? So what is the Trustprint?
Yeah, no, it's not something I can go into in great detail here. But what it is, it's looking at the way people relate. So what are the patterns in your brain that determine how you relate to other people, because those will show up for you at work inevitably. And so it's really understanding, how do you relate to authority? How do you relate with different team members? And what are the triggers that trigger you into a survive mode in those relationships? And what are the triggers that trigger you into a thrive mode in those relationships? And it's a very personal thing. But understanding your own trust print is very useful and important, and then being able to generate that conversation in an appropriate way with your team is very potent.
Another question: how can we explore further our trust print?
Right. Oh, sorry. So there will be also so really thinking through some of the relationships that you have and how those show up for you and how you feel about them will be the beginning of that journey. It's Trustprint is something in the coaching work that I would do individually offline because it's quite a sort of close up and personal thing. But I'm sure lots of you will have close colleagues, close friends that you can start to have those conversations with about. I think survive and thrive triggers are your sort of first point of entry into that, and thinking about how those show up in your relationships at work.
Okay, and are there any companies or individuals even that you can give as examples who are really understanding the brain gender difference and acting accordingly?
Yeah, I can't really name any names because of the projects that I'm involved with. But what I can say is that there are some divisions within large organizations that are taking this kind of thing very seriously and actually starting to make the sort of structural changes to the nature of work and how it gets done. There's a very exciting project that I'm involved with and watching, and I can I think I can talk to this in the scientific community. One of the universities that's very heavily involved with the COVID initiatives, where actively engaging different diverse brains is central to the way that they're trying to problem solve. So I'm fudging it, Demet, in terms of I can't actually name the names at the moment, but there are projects in science and big business that I'm engaged with where these changes are happening.
And in general, who are the people that is taking the lead on this? Are these HR people, or is it driven by the CEO? Is it the XCOM, or are they the business leaders, business owners? So who is the lead in this?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So happily, the HR community is very active in this space. Hurrah! And diversity and inclusion champions and sponsors, and really supporting the leaders that they partner with to be aware of brain gender difference and how it can really help, because it helps at a well-being level at one level and it helps at a business performance level at another, so that it's a win-win-win. In some instances, I've been asked to come in by the CEO. So it varies, but it really works when there is genuine commitment right from the top of the house to make to raise education and awareness levels broadly at scale, to actually just find out the facts, educate yourself. And that's why Paul and I wrote the book, because we wanted to be talking in a bigger conversation than just with our client base. And then thirdly, really practical tools. How do you do this, like moment by moment by moment during the working day?
Okay, all right, very, very interesting. Obviously, this is not a discussion we can have in depth in just 45 minutes, but already you give several insights, and thank you. People in this call can link in with Kate through LinkedIn. Her website is www.mindbridge.co.uk. So please feel free to connect with her and ask more questions if you have any more questions. Well, thank you again, Kate. Before we close, I will be running a couple of more webcasts on leadership topics. So next week we are going to talk about embracing complexity. Please feel free to register to this webcast. And then the week after, we're going to talk about sustainability leadership. Then another webcast is coming on collective leadership and another one on compassionate leadership. So it's a long series of leadership series, and we will have another one talking about the purpose, the noble purpose. So if you're interested in these kind of topics, please register to the webcast through the conference board website. Before you leave, we would ask you to give your feedback by clicking on this link. There's a very small questionnaire. We would be very happy if you tell us about your feedback so that we improve ourselves for the future webcasts. There are many comments coming in the chat box. Kate, people are saying thank you and they find it interesting. So thank you all for your time and see you next time, next week.
Thank you, Demet. Thank you all.
Thank you.